Richard, if my understanding is correct, you are a people first sales leader and organizational team builder who firmly believes that people, vision, values, and behaviors are the foundation of winning sales cultures. Now, you've held multiple senior sales leadership roles across various industries, working across Europe, the United States, and of course the APAC region, working with both startups as well as listed multinational companies. To give people an idea, I'll drop a few names: Barclays, Bottomline, Finastra, Wex, just to name a few. You've, I think, more or less operated for a good part of your career at the intersection of payment, data, and technology. And I'm curious, could you take us back to the first time you discovered that building a mission led sales culture was critical to this whole idea of building sustainable revenue?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, Vinay, thank you so much for being on your podcast. It's terrific to be here and I appreciate that introduction. Yeah, so look, I think like many, if not most sales leaders, I was thrust into leadership. I was a single contributor, a successful one, and then basically promoted with no training suddenly to lead the team I was in. And you learn a lot very quickly, but you also learn perhaps quite how unprepared you are. It's a very different discipline. And so I became very interested in, through the course of my journey, how potentially you could go about things differently, right? Because I think ultimately what this can often lead to, and what I observe in so many organizations, is that the instinct is to get busy being busy and getting drawn into the trenches, or perhaps driving more of a kind of commitment based culture whereby you're basically driving the sales teams, but you're not doing very much to lift yourself out of that, what I call a sort of financial year to financial year survival state, where, you commit and do your year and then you basically start all over again. Right. And then it's very much the same conversation of, guys, what are you committing this quarter? What did you deliver last? What's the delta? How are you going to make it up? And so I was always interested in terms of how do you combine this, what can very often be a kind of sales team can sometimes be a bit of a misnomer, right? There can be a lot of powerful personalities in there who are expert in what they do, but not necessarily harnessed towards a mission in a cohesive way. And then you can often have those sales teams isolated from the rest of the business who are also trying to achieve the same things you are. So there must be a better way. And I've always been resolutely interested in people and people dynamics and coaching and mentoring. And in fact, I fell on that when I was first promoted in terms of trying to teach my methodologies to others. But it's just over time, I've come to that realization that culture on its own is not the answer. Driving sales on its own is not the answer. You often still have boom and bust. But if you marry all of that together and you have a culture that's fused to mission and that's spread into an organization so that aligning cross-functional teams are on the same journey as you, right? And you're thinking beyond that financial year, that's when you can transform something. And I've had the privilege of being able to bring that to life in a couple of organizations as well. That to me is the better way. And it's a lot more fun as well. That in a nutshell has essentially been my journey.
I appreciate that. I'm curious though, because there are probably people listening in going who can identify with some of the stats I came across when I was doing legwork, things like 82% of companies fail to achieve their sustainable growth. Only
Yeah,
28% of employees strongly believe in their culture.
right.
73% of organizations struggle to maintain cultural integrity during rapid scaling periods. Less than 25% of sales leaders effectively connect daily activities to the mission. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with folks who can completely relate to those kinds of stats and perhaps are working in organizations where senior leadership care for culture of the company other than perhaps to go through this exercise of developing a vision and a mission statement and putting it in
Right.
a folder or sticking it up on the wall, but it doesn't seem to play out in day-to-day activities. How
Right.
have you been able to make those connections, not just for yourself, but for the entire organization and particular sales, given how
Yeah.
jaded they may have been from past
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah. Look, those statistics speak for themselves, right? And they don't tell a very pretty picture. And I think we've all been in organizations where, of course, the company has committed to some sort of process to define what their culture is and what their values are. But so often, it's like anything, right? You can detect when something is inauthentic or if it's written and not lived, right? And it's the day to day interactions, it's what you're experiencing from your management through to your senior leadership. That's what's defining the culture. And if it's not living, it isn't culture. And the other thing is it has to resonate, right? This is why I make the comment that everything has to be mission driven, right? I think a lot of people look at this cultural topic and think it's somehow fluffy or it's a nice to have or it's a kind of must have, but doesn't really impact the bottom line. And that to me is the missed opportunity, right? Because as I say, if you can combine it all, things can genuinely transform. And one of the easiest things to think about in this context is our favorite sporting teams, right? The rise and fall is often down to cultural elements, but it also shows just how fragile it is. And I think it's about having a philosophy, but it's actually driving that through into behaviors. So my kind of philosophy on this is that behaviors create culture that lead to results. And if you can identify what those behaviors are, reinforce them, communicate them consistently, align them, and tie those to the mission critical elements that you're trying to achieve, you can actually create a language around your business and an energy around your business that is driving towards the results, such that you can stop driving things in that kind of managerial financial year to financial year point of view. You can start to get into a different dynamic, which is helping your people to be successful, which is translating what you're seeing from the market into what should be the priorities and investments and big bets that are part of your 3 to 5 year horizon. And you combine everybody on that journey. And a number of things will start to happen there. Number one, the organization will start to hum and tick, right? And people will start finding their own solutions. You can do all of this with an insane ambition. And frankly, the most successful organization where I saw this come to light was also the most ambitious, right? And restless as well about being ambitious and winning. But again, the point of view was that it was across the whole organization. But I think what is critical in that is communication. You have to be able to distill this. And what I used to do is distill this down into a one pager and start to align that with your colleagues in operations, for example, support, implementation, customer service, going up to relationship management. Align it with your senior leadership, align it with HR and others so that everyone's very aware of what it is that you're focusing on and start to build those bridges to align what they're focusing on in the same direction. So, that's where it starts to come to life. And then once you see the results of this come through, it can become an inevitable thing, but also a very fragile thing. There's a famous quote from Arsene Wenger, who was the most successful manager of Arsenal Football Club. And he said, culture's like a flower. If you can tend to it and it will grow and it will flourish, but if it's neglected, it can also die. So I think once you have it, you have to ensure that you're consistently celebrating the factors that make it successful, but be very jealous about guarding it as well.
I was wondering if you could perhaps share an example of a company that made this possible. Because
Yeah.
oftentimes people would think of a purpose and vision as being something that's perhaps worthwhile and having an impact on people. And I'm just trying to think of an example. Perhaps it's an NGO that digs water wells and provides water for people who places that do not have access to ordinary water. That would seem to be like a worthwhile goal. But when it comes to
Yeah.
companies, beyond the revenue fact, it's often for people to connect with mission. So I was wondering if
Yeah.
you give an example and perhaps elaborate on
Yeah. So I think this kind of comes, I can't help but thinking about Simon Sinek and the sort of
why.
converting your thinking from not the what and the how of what you do, but the why. And that is, if you can distill, so whatever company you're in, I think it's important, whatever your function is, whatever you do on a day-to-day basis, is to have that sense of that elevator pitch is. If someone was to ask you socially, what do you do? I think part of communicating to drive towards culture is to ensure that upfront in your one pager and the piece that you communicate, so, consistently from, is that reason for why you do what you do. And it should be based upon why. So already that should have some connectivity to mission, because it should involve not just the broad basis of what you're in business to do, but how you do it and why it's important and why it resonates. So I think once you've latched onto that, you've got to have your journey in mind. So you've got to align that to, okay, this is the state of the business in summary level. This is where we are. This is how the growth, this is where we're going towards. And then you can start to define what those behaviors are that are going to drive you towards your focuses and what you need to win. So I think all of that is basically the encapsulation of the one pager, broadly speaking, right? But in order to do all of that, you have to know your business well enough to get to the why, right? And distill that such that it's people latch on to that and they understand it and they can connect to it. But then you have to have done your detective work on the state of the business to know what the focuses are that you can then drive behaviors behind. So the best way I could, when I saw this come to life, I'll give you an example. I walked into a business that was having issues in terms of converting things. The onboarding to monetization of customers was somewhat convoluted, wasn't optimized. And because of that, we had a lot of customers in that sort of mid to mature section of the pipeline that weren't dropping into deals, at least not quickly. So you can identify that through all the data points in your business, but then to connect that to behavior and therefore to culture and mission, you put a language around it. So you say, okay, focus and finish. We got to instill behaviors around focus and finish. You bring that to life by speaking to people, say, what are the top 3 things that if you put down right now would have the most impact on your business and therefore the business? Go and focus on that. And then once those are put down, you find the next 3 and so on. Or it could be, as with a lot of customers or companies, they haven't defined their existing customer base in terms of those 20% or so who are truly strategic, that you can't afford to lose, that you really need to grow, and put a language of land and expand around that. So you put that whole ethos of behavior around that terminology into that team. And it's very simple language, but it's very powerful because people can easily understand it. They can easily see the impacts it has and then how it drives to the contribution to the goal, the journey. And then, as I say, you've just got to consistently communicate this, whatever it's sales team meeting, quarterly reviews, offsites, catch ups. It's the beginning point. So you're just reiterating this information. Then you're celebrating the successes around those values and consistently driving it in that sense. That's how I see it coming to life. But again, it has to be aligned across the business. Otherwise, it can't, sure, you could be the one who's driving the change, but it's better if it's aligned across the business and other people are driving that along with you. So you do need to find those pillars of culture who are going to support you on that journey and reinforce on that journey, not just within your team, but in the broader business.
Okay. There's a fair bit to unpack there. When you say pillars, are these like champions? People
Yeah,
say
that's, yeah, exactly.
buy
Yeah.
into the uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and within say your team, are you would you suggest that we almost create a culture, the overall organizational culture that relates more specifically to objectives that are assigned to team?
Yeah, I think so. Because again, this can be the seed that blossoms out across an organization as well. The way I would think about that is in two ways. One of the things that can drag a sales leader down into the weeds is constantly being in the trenches, fighting, putting out fires and trying to solve the things. And this is not to say nothing can be escalated. Of course, things need to be escalated. But if you're conveying a responsibility on people to think creatively about their business and therefore the business, it's like, by all means, escalate something. But what do you think we should do? Who have you spoken to? Now, of course, there'll be emergency things which you do need to solve for in the moment, but there'll be plenty where you push that back. Like, come back to me when you've spoken to someone about it, right? And that's going to create a creativity, but you can align that to some sensibility, whatever the language is, I don't know, better together or find making magic, whatever language you want to put around it, but putting again the responsibility on someone to find their own network within the business, right? So again, you're spreading out from yourself. My goal is to find the solution to get this customer across the line. I need to speak to operations or product or legal, whoever it might be, and align that message and journey and find the solutions. That in and of itself can start to generate, I think, a broader understanding of action, which can then bring culture more in a cohesive way, in a full company way towards the market. So that's the way I would think about that.
It's one of the issues that come to mind is culture can be serial, if I could use that
Yeah,
term. That is
sure,
often difficult to measure. Now, there's a lot
sure.
of talk around affirming behavior we identify as contributing to culture, the overall mission of the organization, which is,
Yeah,
given your experience, I wonder if there are other metrics that you would look at to
sure.
measure culture and make sure it's truly aligned, apart from just being well documented.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. Do you know what? I think it's hard to put a metric on it, to be honest. But I think you can have barometers. And one of those, somebody said in my book, I mentioned fun so many times, right? Now, business should be fun, right? Things are not fun when things are not working. And I think of sales teams and organizations, they're a bit like car engines, right? They're very expert components, small and large, and they're all designed to get you towards an endpoint. And that journey can be pleasant or it can be very unpleasant. You can be bunny hopping along or it can be a smooth trajectory. So I think within that context, you can certainly sense, feel, see an organization that is happy and having fun in what it's doing. But I'll guarantee that if it is, probably being very successful as well, right?
Mm.
And your ultimate metric is your results. And this is why I would never, culture on its own, honestly, meaningless. But if it's mission led, mission focused, and it's driving towards the results, you're getting them. People are having fun. They're energized. There's a psychologically safe space and there's collaboration. There's space for ideas and you've encouraged good ideas to come from anywhere, right? That's the ultimate metric on anything. But you can also do soft things in this annual reviews, quarterly reviews, whatever your cycle is. You can put targets on the soft things, the skills, as well as the hard ones, right? And I think putting some import on working collaboratively. So you're basically asking that person coming to review, think about examples of what they've done. You should know them already. Examples, what they've done to bring solutions to bear that have involved collaboration. or, that sort of. So again, identify those that align to the behaviors that you want and show that it's important, because whilst there may not be a hard metric on it, we're expecting that examples of that to come to light. And then again, in whatever your forums are, you've got to have those moments where you celebrate those successes, and they can be small that help you get to the incremental gains that arrive at something big. They can be big ones as well. But as long as you're pulling out those messages, you're also reinforcing, right? So I think it's a little more than trying to find a measurement, because your ultimate measurement is how successful you're being in the market.
I'm curious. Leadership is obviously a key aspect of this process. You yourself have had several leadership positions. I'm curious, when did you first realize that you had the leadership quality?
Wow. I think honestly, you don't necessarily know that at first. I think one of the challenges is, right, leadership, sales leadership, it's not taught, and especially sales leadership, it's not taught. There's not a university degree around it. I think there probably should be. There should be some form of qualification. And like I say, you're more than likely thrust into these positions. And what I reflect on in my journey, certainly when I speak to friends and colleagues and people who I've met, there's not a lot of emphasis on people or even skills for people to actually take a moment and listen to what is coming from within. What are the doubts and fears? What are the inhibitors that you're feeling? And what are the destinations you want to get to? What are the leadership changes that you want to make? And you may not have the answers as to how you're going to get there, but it's very important to listen to yourself. And imposter syndrome is a great one, right? Because I think it's very easy to obsess about what you don't know, right? And you can be in conversations with companies which dissolve into really minute discussions about elements of a product or a market or whatever it might be, that you can feel lost in because you don't know that detail, right? And you have to be able to manage all of that, but also center yourself in terms of what you do know. So I think in terms of my journey, it was probably, I had a very normal, I think, trajectory in that sense that promoted with no training. It took me about a year and a half before I had the wherewithal to go and ask my leadership for training in myself and investment in myself to become better, because I felt like I had to earn that before I could go and ask for it. Then I was invited to come and join another company and turn around a situation, right? I think it's probably by your third appointment or something where you have enough experience combined with some reflection on what your skills are, that you start to may not have a philosophy yet, but you start to identify what your core values are, that you can start to build something around. So what I'm trying to describe here is a journey. I don't think leadership is inherent. You can have certain qualities, of course, but I think it's learned. And I think the best leaders are those who have learned. And unfortunately, in our commercial and work experiences, a lot of that's through mistakes and errors and reflections upon what could have I done better and all the rest of it. So ultimately, all I've tried to do in this book is attempt to write the book that I was looking for at various stages in my career, right? The promotion, the turnaround, and when I've had opportunities to start something from scratch, and look at it through that lens and try to put something very practical in terms of steps that you take along that. But what I would advise in all of this is you can't just use it like a template. I think I've seen people do it and it doesn't work. It works to a certain extent, but it doesn't work. You have to bring your authentic self to it.
Are there specific behaviors you noted differentiate between leadership as opposed to directional leadership, especially in sales?
Yeah. So you know what? People first leaders to me are the ultimate salespeople because they do everything that you would do in a sale. They ask questions and they wait for the answers, right? and they listen intently. And then they often throw that back onto somebody. Like, what do you think we should be doing? How can we solve for that? What is a better way? And I think that's ultimately what the best salespeople are doing as well, combined with being able to tell good stories. Because I think the battle in a sale is not to speak your language, it's to learn how to speak the customer's language, and also to learn what they're facing, what the challenges are, what the opportunity cost of not doing anything is, and then articulate it all in their language aligned to their outcomes. That's how the best do it. And that's how the best leaders do it. But they do it in such an authentic way that conveys, I care about you. I'm interested in your development and growth, and insanely ambitious to achieve whatever it is we're in business to achieve. That I think is because they elicit some sense that you're in this together. Whereas that sort of, what are you committing to deliver this quarter, month, whatever? That's a legitimate way to drive things. It's how a lot of companies are driven. But it's not conveying, it's pushing all the responsibility over to the salesperson without supporting them in terms of how they can win or do more. And I think it's often not aligned to identifying fundamentally what your value proposition and winning proposition in the market is. So what you tend to get is salespeople shooting for everything because they have to commit to that number. They have to try and hit it, right? Which can often mean that you get a lot of bad business as well as good business coming your way. And what it seems to me that the people first leader is also about in trying to help others be successful is that they're better able to do the other part of the business, which is to identify what is the market telling us and where can we put our investments to help the salespeople be more successful. Because just asking for commitment seems to me to be doing half the job. Because how can you go and ask senior leadership for investment? How can you say that this is more of a priority than something else if you can't articulate the dynamics of the marketplace and the dynamic data of the marketplace? So again, I think there's a lot there, but I think it's just in the fundamentals of how they run their business, making it a combined effort to get towards a destination as opposed to how are you going to get us there, Vinay? You see what I mean?
So, just hearing what you said, I would I would take away, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, that perhaps one of the key qualities of people first leaders, especially in sales organizations, they are inherently curious people,
Yep.
potentially their customers. So and so
Yep.
that it's quite natural for them to be on top of data and trends that they see in the place. I see
Yep.
you nodding, saying yes, so I think you agree. While that is a terrific wallet, some of the people listening in would be thinking of situations where they were essentially brought into leadership, and
Yep.
one of the prominent memories of their experience is that of dealing with this constant cycle of crisis management.
Sure.
And so
Yeah.
I'm sure you speak to many folk in that. So, what would
Sure.
be your advice or frame to break
Yep.
and away from?
Yeah. So the best way, to my mind, of getting out of that sort of trench warfare situation, right, is again, you've got to become the detective to understand your business and the fundamentals that are either driving it or preventing you from being as successful as you can be. And there are lots of data sets there. There's the people side, there's what your CRM is telling you about the dynamics of how you're finding your customers and how they're translating through to the final end. There's a sense of how are people going about their business? Because I think you've got to convey on people that they are running a business within the business. You know, how are they finding their prospects and converting on them? Is there a sense across the piece of what the value proposition and winning use cases are? How does the product meet this? What are the gaps? What is competition able to do that you're not? There's a whole range of stuff that you can bring. And I think whilst you may be driven into these minutiae discussions or day-to-day fights, you've got to find the time to compile all of this, right? Such that you're able to define where you can focus for the best outcomes, right? And start to disengage yourself from being pulled all the time. Because if you can't think about investment or next horizons if you're constantly looking down, right? And you can't really easily build a direction or narrative or deep culture if you're doing that as well. And then it really comes down to what are the dynamics of all of these situations? I reflect back on at least 2 organizations that I've been at where I came into it. And it's very interesting to hear what the management group is talking about. And so many occasions in these 2 companies, you might enter a situation which has an agenda, right? A very clear agenda, but then it dissolves. And it's often dissolving into some sort of debate about some sort of fractional element of the product or how you sell it in the market. And quite often it derails everything, right? Suddenly the agenda's gone, suddenly the time is gone, suddenly the end of the meeting comes, and no one's taking any actions for outcomes, right? And then it all happens again. And to me, that's a very good example of an environment where there's a problem with the product translating to the marketplace, but there's also a problem of what your value proposition is, what your winning use case is. And there's a mismatch between the two. And there's probably some sort of insane ambition that's driving everything, but it's driving everything in a very cloudy way, right? And not bringing out the outcomes. That can very easily be translated then into departmental actions. Products chasing after this, sales is chasing after that. But again, it's not necessarily aligned to a good outcome. So again, you've got to find out where can we play and win and focus and stop wasting our time where we're creating situations that cause more problems than not. How do we fix for those? What are the priorities and investments we can make to make that better and align that across the group so everyone's seeing a singular vision? And then again, what are your team's dynamics? Are they part of the problem in the sense that they're constantly escalating things without some sort of due process to think about it? Are you becoming part of the problem because you're allowing that to happen as well, right? So that one feeds the other. How much are you speaking to product about what you're seeing in the marketplace, what the customers are telling you? How much of that voice of customers coming into your business, or are the priorities misaligned because there's some other sensibility of what's important? Do you have leadership that jumps from one priority to another because that's the loudest voice or that's the biggest opportunity? You've got to define all of this, but that's where you can start to push things out. The other thing I think very much, I think there's a danger with some who are promoted into leadership is that they can't let go. They're scared to convey leadership on others, right? I heard someone, I think it's Darren Mitchell, he runs a great podcast on sales. He said that the goal of a leader should be to make themselves redundant. Now, that's really emotive language because you obviously don't want to talk yourself out of a job. But what he's really saying there, you've got to find your leaders and inspire them to grow and take on more responsibility and to do that because it frees you to think of how you can make the next big impact, right? And start to convey that. And you certainly can't do that if you're down in the weeds.
Certainly. Which raises an interesting point because oftentimes this element of succession, investment in your team, etc., in order to ensure that you're developing leaders,
Yeah.
is not incorporated into the overall culture. Do you recommend people create an environment that is also nurturing and that allows for this leadership development?
Yeah, 100%. So I think if it doesn't already exist, again, this is about collaborating across the piece, right? And you have to find your partner in HR, business leadership as well, and make the case for that. Ensure that you're obviously with your leadership as well, and make that a senior leadership activity as best you can, so that there is some sort of annual review of who is the talent in your business that you need to nurture, that you need to ensure is growing. Quite often they're flat structures. So the opportunity for promotion, honestly, for talent is to leave. And you obviously don't want that. Why do people stay? Because they're successful, because they're earning money, or they're getting other achievements that drive them. They perceive they're invested in and they're growing. They have something to learn. So yeah, you've got to identify who those people are, identify how that could work in a succession planning environment, or what are the opportunities for promotion and growth such that your organization allows for that. And then if it doesn't, then ensure that you have coaching, mentorship, training, growth, and that you're bringing those people into the conversation as well to understand what they want, because what you may want for them may not be what they want, right? So again, I go back to that piece about finding your pillars or finding your leaders. You've got to have an open conversation with them about that as well, because some people don't want extra responsibility, or you may not understand what you're asking them as well. But you've got to institutionalize that whole piece. Otherwise, you will find that you're losing people. I've done it. We've all done it. You take a job offer somewhere else for more money, better opportunity, bigger job scope, right?
Certainly.
And then suddenly the existing company probably has a hole to fill.
This is really interesting. When it comes to go-to-market, what elements would you suggest we include in a transformational go-to-market?
Yeah.
The traditional component.
I'm often, maybe I'm not surprised anymore, but so many organizations don't have one. And I've heard commercial leaders complaining that there's not a go-to-market plan in a company. And I always think to myself, I'm sorry, that's your job. But it should be marketing creating it, or it should be whoever. It's not, it should be the commercial person, honestly. To my mind, the creation of the go-to plan starts with identification of what your value propositions are, what your winning value propositions are. And that's often about narrowing the focus and getting away from that kind of sell everything type of attitude to, okay, can we define who audience we're selling to and why it's a winning proposition, and then narrow that focus in. And you should already have examples in your business. And if you don't, you should hopefully be winning examples. And then you're really distilling the activity to finding the repeat ones, right? So I think you have to be quite singular about understanding that, right? And then you can start to map out where you then start to recruit the top of your funnel and how you go about doing that. And then start to define what are the other opportunities that you can put investment behind. But you need to articulate that. I think you need to articulate that separate to your sales plan, right? Because the sales plan, I would often ask the individual salespeople to make their plan, like Q3, tell me, we know within a factor what your number's going to be, how are you going to go about it, where are you going to focus, how are you going to make sufficient damage early in the year to get towards the number, and what do you need to win? I need their input, which also gives me a sense of how they're thinking about things. And then when the inevitably bigger number comes, you've got an easier delta to manage, because these people have already built into it and presumably believe in what they've written, right? But that needs to be locked into that go-to-market. So again, everyone knows how to play, where to win, and you can take that to product and align it with product. You can take it to other parts of your business to streamline those, hopefully, and align people. And marketing as well. You mustn't forget them. If you're not focusing on that as much as you are the other elements, unfortunately, though, I honestly think that's the lived experience. I remember I would always look for my predecessor sales plan whenever I was either brought into a company or when I was first promoted. I could never find it. And that, I think, tells you a story as well.
I can relate to that. Um,
Yeah.
Absolutely. This idea of having the right people
Yeah.
in your sales, obviously, we need to go through a process of ensuring that the culture that exists, the behaviors are being displayed, etc.
Yeah.
Comes to helping and investing in each of your team members, I think we're at an age where personal brand increasingly being recognized and
Yep. Yep.
in companies. How are you ensuring that there is a fit between a personal and the
Yeah.
overall company, so that going off on tangents or throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks because there's so many different
Yeah.
messages coming through, that
Sure.
there is a degree of synchronicity between your personal brand and company
Yeah.
mission.
I think, again, it comes down to that curiosity. You got to know your people, right? And you got to have some sensibility of, without being intrusive, what drives them, what motivates them. And you got to know the full individual, right? It's not enough to just focus everything in the work world. You got to have a sense of how they show up in other aspects of their life, because I think you're dealing with the complete individual. I think personal brands are important. How much you bring that, it's not a conversation I would normally have to say, hey, what's your personal brand? How can we align that to the business? But I think it's important that people have a sense of what that is. And funnily enough, I'm just submitting a second book here, which is a guide to help people create their own job opportunities, right? And how to network effectively to do that, how to break the recruitment cycle for many reasons. And one of the subjects in that is how do you make people confident, but also comfortable with self-promotion? And for many people who have a problem with the word sales, let alone what it implies, having some sense that they actually think of themselves as solving a problem when they're talking to a potential hiring manager, which means to say, understand what your value is, understand what outcomes you can drive for what results, and have more of an ROI driven conversation, right? Because it frustrates me so much how few candidates do any type of research at all, and how few take control of an interview process for their outcomes. And everything's coming to the same place here. In order to do all of that, okay, fine. You've got to have a relationship with sales and self-promotion and understanding that it's positive, it's solutioning, it's not bragging or boastful or whatever. But you also have a sense of what your own values are, what your philosophy is. Now, not everyone's going to have a philosophy, but how you can get to that is to start by interrogating what your values are. What is important to you? And you can do that in the facets of me, we, and work, right? So family might be important. Having loving relationships might be important. Being collaborative, but you have to honestly interrogate yourself around those. Once you have a sense of that, then you can drive that into what are your passions and what are your attributes. And again, in a work environment, it's less about what you do. It's how do you do it, right? And that's true of any function. How do I drive, or how do I focus on what I do for the best outcomes that drive the business? Now the job is to marry those two. So you've got to identify what is driving someone, how they're going about their business, what they've encouraged them to think about what their philosophy is, and then marry that to the outcomes of the business. So a large part of that, I think, is that individual's journey. And I think the leaders need to do that as well, because I think a large part of this is about having some sort of a growth mentality. And again, you asked me what are the great attributes of the best leaders I've come across. I think being humble and never thinking that you've arrived. Think back to a great example. One of the best leaders I ever worked with, we had a very challenging year set ahead of us. We had a leadership offsite. So every leader of every function of the business was in a round table. We were defining not only what we were trying to achieve, but how we were going to work with one another. And our leader, he brought his coach with him on the day, who was in the room observing him and his interaction with us, which I thought was incredibly vulnerable. But it also imparts this person doesn't feel that they're trying to grow and learn as well, which also instills upon you, oh, I need to improve in a lot of areas, right? So I think this is all about, it is an individualized journey, but there is a process of how to get there. And I try to help in terms of templates or techniques or models of how you can get there. The Me, We, Work one is a good one because it starts to define those in categories of your life, right? And there's another one, which is write your future self a letter, right? Which is reflecting on where you're at, what you're afraid of, what you're trying to drive towards, what you're hoping to build. And obviously you can reflect upon that when you come to read it and then do it again.
Great insights and points there, Richard. Your journey today. What would you say is your personal area of strength?
I think having that sort of growth mentality and being curious, the combination of the two, because I think the danger in life is that you can just keep plowing on, right? And not reflect and bring on board the learnings of your past to help you be better in the future. So a lot of what we've spoken about today is the journey as a life journey to this point, right? But it's enabled me to instill an approach that I found to be successful and that I would be confident that if I was asked to come into an organization tomorrow that I didn't know anything about, I would be able to have a positive impact on it. And I mean that from a results point of view, but everything we've spoken up driving it towards that. But that's born of curiosity and a growth mindset. Absolutely.
In that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't?
Don't know, but should. I think we touched on some of this already. I think the reason why I'm so passionate about this topic is because it's not necessarily the mainstream. It's not necessarily the norm. And I think you could go out on the street right now and ask 10 people, what were the attributes of the best companies you've ever worked for? And some of the topics we talked about today will be in the minority, unfortunately. And I just think there are so many companies that are trying to obviously drive towards consistent success, and are doing it in a particular way. But there are better ways and there are more sustainable ways. And what I'm really keen on is that sense that once you've created this environment, people will stay for it because they see a journey. They see a journey within themselves, but they see the success and the journey within the company they're at. And that's what I think many companies don't understand how to bring to life. So yeah, culture married to mission is one. Within the sales team environment, having a go-to-market that fuses to your sales plan that is made real by the behaviors that are driving the outcomes. I think so many companies struggle in those environments. And it's probably because of this sense that there's still this thinking that leadership is somehow inherent and not a learnt endeavor.
So with this idea of fusing mission with culture to create transformational revenue growth, are there perhaps a couple of areas that we haven't touched on as yet that you find doesn't get much air? If so, what would they be?
So I think the one I would think about is that point where you can start to think about your 3 to 5 year horizons, right? In one of the organizations I can think of, which I joined needing a turnaround situation, it was dysfunctional. There were some people problems. There were some performance issues as well, somewhat isolated. You can't start to think about your 3 to 5 year journey when you're first arriving at an environment like that. There's a lot to do. You've got to go through that business and understanding what is happening in that business, what the dynamics are, where you need to focus, who are the people you can build your culture around, what support and need and help you need from the wider organization. You've got to get into all that business, and then you've got to operationalize that, right? Through your cadences and through your interactions so that you start to bring to life a new journey. And you've got to show up and lead that. But there comes a point, and in the case of this business, it was probably about a year and a half in, where we'd helped consolidate the people environment. People were very much attuned to where we were headed, how we were doing business. And we'd started to build the team. And I involved that team in selecting other people because I wanted them to choose from a cultural standpoint as well. So we started to have that foundation. I'd already started to instill that requirement to be creative in terms of how you're thinking about your business, what ideas you're bringing to the table, how you're dealing with problems that we're facing on a day-to-day basis. So at that point, you can start to think, okay, what's next? And in this case, it could be opening up of new markets, getting new licenses that will allow us to drive business. It could be about summarizing the data that you gathered about business that you can't currently win today because you don't have this feature or you don't have access to whatever it might be, and start to prioritize. This is our journey. If we had X, we can now look to an additional piece of our business. And over the next fourth year, maybe there's another element we could add. Our business could look like this in 5 years compared to where we are now. And then you start to have that conversation with your senior leadership, and some very interesting things start to happen, right? You start to have to put some meat on that bone, but then get into conversations about investment. And then you might find that various tools of the business, various levers are being made available to you to make that a reality. And then when you start to achieve those things, the belief of the whole organization, it becomes something you can palpably feel. And it's no longer then about your financial year. It's about where we're going to be. Now, I love that moment when you first present that, and people maybe, because they've been through this journey, can't quite see it. But then you reflect back to them, think about where we were, think about what we've achieved to get to this point. And then you start to see, oh, wow. And yeah, people start to believe in that. So I think that to me is the biggest one. And that's where you start to be transformational and you start to put all these components together to get beyond that survival mode, if I can put it that way.
So I think we touched upon this idea of also investing in cross-functional
Yeah.
relationships
Yeah.
with your various teams involved. Given what you're describing, you obviously want data to back up your arguments for an X feature to be added, etc., which would suggest that you're also wanting information that, at least in some organizations, tends to be held in the
Can be. Yeah.
in which case you almost need trust between some of these key relationships. How would you go about fostering without, given the prejudices
Yeah.
people have held?
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you asked that because to my mind, you've got to be selling all the time. Just because you're a sales leader doesn't mean you stop selling. Now, of course, you get those who become more administratively focused and more operational and really get into the weeds of the CRM and everything, right? But I think the ones who are most successful will continue to sell, which comes back to your original question about what are the attributes of best leaders that come across. So what does that really mean? You've got to have some sensibility of being part of the sales process, whether it's assisting on large accounts or whatever it might be, and asking your people what role they would like you to play as well, right? That's a key component of it. But in order, being specific about your question, you've got to sell to the cross functions. You've got to sell to your leadership, right? Which means that you've got to be able, just as you would with a customer, to be able to articulate what the challenges are and what the solutions are in a kind of data-driven conversation in the language of that department or that leader, but always towards an outcome. And if you can do that successfully, not only can you align people, but you can drive people towards an outcome. So if it's hard to do it in isolation without air cover, right? Without some senior leadership backing on it. But again, you can't do it if you haven't articulated in summary form, what the whole mission is, right? And if you've done that, you can very easily then go to the head of operations and sit with them and say, hey, I just want to go through the priorities as I see them matched against the outcomes and align that with yours. And you can very quickly see just how off base you are from that kind of conversation. And then you can see what the scale of the challenge is, right? And then you can bring your sales power to that. But just as you would winning the most important deal in the market, you've got to bring that kind of sensibility to it, right? Which is about understanding your buying cohort, aligning them, understanding what the ROI is and what the steps are towards that. You must be selling all the time.
You make a great point there. If you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be takeaway?
Top takeaway. Okay. I would say that nothing works in isolation, right? You have to have a combined approach to it, but you have to fundamentally understand what it is you're trying to achieve, the why of why you do what you do, and then fuse your people to that mission through the behaviors. That's what I would do. And as I say, behaviors create culture that leads to results. If you look at it through that lens, instead of just driving results, you have the opportunity to build something transformational and sustainable.
And just to be clear, when we talk about behaviors that lead to results, perhaps some of us are thinking in terms of dollar figures. Would I be right that we need to think broader than that, and perhaps along the lines of how do we actually impact people's lives in a positive manner, at least in their job roles?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, look, I'm coming, just to be very transparent, I'm coming from a commercial world and a commercial point of view. So we're often thinking in terms of the dollar values. That's our primary objective, of course. And I think that has to be front and center in all of this, right? If you're driving a commercial operation. But within the underlying pieces of that jigsaw, 100%. So what I would be encouraging, but also, yeah, so within that cohort of senior leadership, I would be encouraging the HR business practitioner to have their version of this, right? Which does come into the human side of HR and how you're developing and growing your people. But that's also incumbent on you as a leader. Yeah, it would be within the whole piece. But I would want that, or I would love that to be seen to be translated into others' versions of what you're sharing with them.
And Richard, for those who are listening and watching and want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Thank you for that. LinkedIn, first and foremost, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm often posting about these subjects. I'd love to have a conversation with people. Secondly, the first book, which is the cultural leader, sustaining people, achieving results. That's available on Amazon and wherever you get books. And then I have another one coming out, hopefully this year, probably Q2, which is around how to network, how to create your own job opportunities, how to become comfortable with the idea of self-promotion, and again, finding your values that help you drive towards that as well.
We'll include links to that in the show notes. And perhaps when it comes out, we'll include a link to that as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much for doing this. This has been brilliant.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Vinay. Thank you.